Greetings to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Now, it pains me to admit, but all of you out there that don't have data centers at your house are probably laughing at us folks with data centers at our house right about now, because while we were laughing at you in the wintertime when we could just huddle up next to our data centers, aka our server racks, our home labs, for warmth to keep us warm with all the heat output they generate, as we get into this horrible time of the year where it's cold at night but hot during the day, and you kind of get into this phase where you can't really turn the heat off because it gets cold, but you can't really turn the AC on because it doesn't quite get hot enough inside. But the issue here is when you have your data center, it does not care what the temperature is, it just pumps out heat. So your house or whatever room your data center happens to be in will get significantly hotter because there's no cold outside to radiate in to cool it down, and there's no air conditioning running to also cool it down, so it is just able to go free reign, pumping out as much heat as it wants and making your space quite unlivable, or at the very least uncomfortable. Cannot say that I'm necessarily experiencing that right about now, but I would assume you would be able to make an educated guess as to if I am actually experiencing that right now or not. But anyway, with that little tangent out of the way, giving you folks without data centers a little chance to make fun of us with data centers, there you go. So let's start off our episode with our trivia question. And this week's trivia question is: a modem is a device that converts data from digital formats to an analog one. And what does modem stand for? So what does modem stand for? And that is your trivia question for the week. So before we get into cybersecurity tip for the week, one thing that has been quite a hot topic, or point of contention, if you will, in the cybersecurity space has been the whole TikTok situation. And as you might be aware, at least in the United States, there has been calls to ban the app for years now, and it's not really ever gone anywhere. I mean, I think the closest that we've gotten to a ban is, I'm trying to remember when it was, but there was something passed where like members of Congress or something like that wouldn't be able to install TikTok on their government cell phones. And I'm not sure if it was specifically just Congress people or if it was like government employees in general, but it was something to that effect where folks in the government, at least select folks in the government anyway, weren't allowed to have TikTok on their government-issued smartphone, in large part because the vast swaths of data that TikTok harvests from its users and is subjugated to give to the Chinese Communist Party whenever the Chinese Communist Party sees fit. So there's obviously been a lot of contention there with the app, but now it actually kind of seems like it might potentially actually get banned this time. So in case you weren't, well, I guess the whole idea of TikTok getting banned, probably if you, I would wager to guess that if you asked the TikTok addicts how they're feeling right about now, they would probably say something to the effect of,
"Bro, I'm straight up not having a good time."
So yeah, I would assume they probably aren't too happy that their potential addiction might be getting banned. But even if it does get banned, as we'll go through, what the bill that was passed here actually kind of gets into, there are still obviously ways around it. So for starters, the U.S. House anyway, they passed the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act by a vote of 352 to 65, which would force ByteDance, which is TikTok's the owner company of TikTok, to sell the app within 6 months or face a ban on U.S. app stores and websites. So, in essence, assuming this, well, of course, first off, this bill would have to get through the Senate, and assuming it does get through the Senate, President Biden has mentioned that he would sign it if it got to his desk, so I guess it's kind of up to the Senate now on if this goes forward. But essentially what this ban would do, it would force app store owners like Apple and Google to essentially remove the app completely from the App Store and not allow you to update it at all or anything like that. And it would also require internet service providers to make TikTok inaccessible on internet browsers and internet access in general within the U.S. But again, here is the rub, if you will. While technically Apple wouldn't be able to put it in their app store, Google wouldn't be able to put it in their app store. I mean, if you already had the app downloaded, I mean, it'd still be on your phone. And there are things called virtual private networks that allow you to potentially, appear like you're somewhere else. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that you could supposedly connect to a VPN in a country that is not the United States and still get access to your TikTok addiction. So rest assured, the TikTok addicts, even if this bill goes through, that doesn't mean you will go completely without your addiction, but it will unfortunately hamper your ability to access said addiction. But it won't be impossible to access it. But even if you don't have it installed on your phone, theoretically, I mean, you'd still be able to go to the website, of course, assuming you had a VPN installed and were using it, or I'm not exactly sure how it would be distributed, but I'm sure you could come across, especially for Android, I'm sure you could easily find what are they called? APKs or something like that. Whatever the format is for apps on Android. As you can tell, I'm not I'm not really an Android user. Don't really use Android. But you could easily sideload the app or basically put it on your phone yourself. Of course, that would be some extra steps involved. And if you're on the Apple side of things, you can't really sideload it. I mean, you can. It's just a little bit more of a hassle because first you have to get access to the app, and then you'd have to install it on your phone with your developer account, which if you don't have a developer account, that's fine, but you just have to reinstall it on your phone or iPad or whatever you're installing it on every 7 days because that's how good the certificate's good for. If you have a developer account, I think I want to say 90 days. At least that's what it used to be. I'm not sure if that still is. But in essence, there's a lot more work involved. But all this to say, just because the app would be quote-unquote banned, it does not mean you still couldn't access it, is basically what I'm getting at here. But of course, this being a bill that is passed in the United States, it of course is as clear as mud when it comes to the clarity of what this bill actually does, because of course it's not just banning TikTok and ByteDance. Because the bill says, quote, "It shall be unlawful for an entity to distribute, maintain, or update, or enable the distribution, maintenance, or updating of a foreign adversary-controlled application by carrying out within the land or maritime borders of the United States." So, in essence, it's not just TikTok or ByteDance. It is any application controlled by a foreign adversary. So this, of course, gives the United States the ability to ban other apps down the line, not just TikTok. Although I will give them credit here. Unlike previous pieces of legislation that have been supposedly known as the gonna ban TikTok app, this one actually calls out TikTok and ByteDance by name, whereas previous iterations didn't. So I at least have to give them credit there. But the rules specifically is the owner of the app, if they're controlled by a foreign adversary, they have to sell off the app within 6 months, or that is when the ban actually comes into place. The other key here is what determines an app being controlled by a foreign adversary is up to the president's discretion. Now, while that could potentially seem like a bad thing, there are a couple of stipulations in there that the bill does point out to at least somewhat restrict this. So first, the bill points out that the president if they were to essentially call an app essentially lump an app that isn't TikTok into this category to be banned, they would have to issue a public statement and report to Congress about the determination 30 days prior, again quoting from the bill here, describing the specific national security concern involved and containing a classified annex and description of what assets would need to be divested to execute the qualified divestiture, end quote. So essentially, the app won't be banned if the company, which I guess is a foreign adversary-owned company, if that company sells whatever components of the app off, then the app can continue to remain, is essentially what it's getting at here. But essentially, the president would have to disclose why it's a threat to national security and what would have to be divested in order for it to escape said ban, assuming they don't divest whatever assets those are within 6 months. And there are even more restrictions here. So the bill also points out what is considered a foreign adversary, which according to another bill, it includes North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. So this does slightly restrict the president from going completely rogue and being like, oh, this app from Mexico, I don't like it, so I'm going to ban it because this app is owned by a foreign adversary. So yeah, that's not exactly going to cut it. So I guess that is another potential benefit here. But personally, I haven't talked about TikTok much on this podcast personally because I don't care about it at all, and I think it's a horrible app for reasons I've already previously mentioned. But I could honestly care less if TikTok gets completely banned. But the area where I do have to kind of agree with the TikTok addicts that don't want it to get banned is the fact that I don't particularly like the idea of the government telling me that I can't use an app or service. I mean, personally, I don't really like that too much. I'm not sure about you, but I kind of like my freedoms here in the United States of America. So I don't particularly like that. But on the other hand, I could honestly care less if TikTok gets banned. Like, this doesn't apply to me whatsoever. But due to the language of the bill, it's not limited to just TikTok. So in theory, other applications could potentially be banned in the future, would this bill be passed. But even more than that, my main issue I think I have personally with the bill is it doesn't actually fix the problem, right? Because the problem is not the fact that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company and the Chinese government can then get whatever data they want from the app. No, that's not the issue. The issue is this app known as TikTok is able to harvest so much data on people that that data then becomes valuable to the Chinese Communist Party. So it's not the fact that the app is owned by a company that is subjugated to the Chinese Communist Party. The issue is that this app has so much data on its users that it is then potentially a security risk for U.S. citizens in the United States as a whole. So really, we shouldn't be looking, at least in my opinion, we shouldn't be looking at banning apps specifically because, I mean, at that point, you're just playing whack-a-mole. The issue we should be focusing on is actual user data privacy and restricting what data applications can actually collect and track users with, because this would not only fix the TikTok problem, but it would also fix the problem that United States companies are guilty of, like those of Facebook or, Meta, Google, Amazon, and all of those other big tech companies that harvest arguably just as much data as TikTok does. But I guess because they're United States-owned companies, that's okay because then the U.S. government, in theory, I guess, could ask for the data, or in other terms, it's not being sold to a foreign adversary. But I guess it just depends on who's mass harvesting the data. So, I mean, personally, I don't like any data being harvested from me, which is why I try to minimize how much I use the data harvesting apps that I do have. But yeah, so personally, I think if you really wanted to fix the problem, you would go after trying to regulate how much and what data apps can collect on users, because that would actually get to the root of the problem rather than just playing whack-a-mole. But that's just my thoughts and opinions. If you think I am an idiot and just completely wrong, that's totally okay. If you think I'm right on the money, that's also totally okay. But with that, let's move into our cybersecurity tip for the week. So this week's cybersecurity tip is more, I guess it's not unconventional, but not something that you would think of when you think of cybersecurity. And that is, you should check your bank statements and just credit card statements and all that stuff in general. Now, you're probably asking yourself, what the heck does that have to do with cybersecurity? And the reason I brought it up is because it's, aside from other more common forms of cybercrime like viruses, ransomware, and that kind of stuff, identity theft is probably one of the biggest forms of cybercrime out there. And this can happen obviously in a number of ways. A fairly common one is, website breaches of databases. If it's like a marketplace, like if say Amazon got hacked or something, there's a potential, and user data got stolen, there's a chance that credit card information could have been in there. So one thing you'd be able to identify if you check your bank statements frequently is you'd be able to see if there are any suspicious charges made to your account that you didn't intend to. Now, generally, most credit cards and banks in general have at least some kind of fraud detection in place to try to check for things like this, but obviously they're not 100%. I've had a few instances of false positives where I was trying to buy something and for whatever reason the purchase got flagged and the transaction got declined, got contacted by the credit card company. Most recently, actually, was a few months ago. I was trying to, it was a really weird situation because I was trying to make a purchase and it got flagged for whatever reason by the credit card company that it was potentially fraudulent. And I was like, no. So, and then of course they sent this through like a text message. And then of course I responded and I was like, no, this is legitimate. But because that transaction got declined, when I later tried to redo the purchase because I, informed the credit card company that no, this is a legit transaction, the place I was trying to purchase from, which happened to be GameStop, they flagged the transaction and wouldn't let it go through. And I got into this crazy, back and forth of it was not going through, called the credit card company, called GameStop, and it was a nightmare. So false positives do happen. And obviously, because false positives happen, it's not going to be 100% success rate. So if you check your bank statements frequently, that you'll be able to catch things like this. And the other reason why this is so important to do is because of how much of our commerce has been either completely digital through online or credit cards at actual stores. There's not a whole lot of check writing and cash paying going on these days. A lot of it's electronic, so it's a lot easier for things like this to slip through the cracks and you not know that your credit card got stolen or whatever. So if you're checking, that's one way to identify that a potential identity theft happened. And of course, the quicker you can catch these things, the easier it'll be to resolve. Since it's a lot easier to dispute a credit card charge or a fraudulent credit card charge the month it happened rather than, say, 6 months down the line when you already paid the bill. So obviously, the quicker you can identify these things, the better, and also the quicker you can recover from these potential identity theft incidences. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. And I hope you are excited because now we get to move into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. And this week, it is not a 100% Scrum meeting. Of course, last week I mentioned that I should rename this segment from the nerdy stuff I've been doing to the weekly Scrum or something like that, because how much of the segment had basically been completely taken over by software updates for the video game I'm working on. But this week I actually have some stuff that wasn't strictly that, and which is what I want to start with first, because this is actually something I'm actually kind of hyped about. So getting back into my home lab, I have multiple hypervisors. One of them recently has been essentially completely powered off, and I generally don't really use, I'll spin it up if I want to play with something on it, or maybe monthly, just to make sure I keep it updated and back up the VMs and all that kind of good stuff. But this hypervisor in particular, you actually might remember it a few months ago. It was probably more than a few. When I was upgrading my hypervisors to SSDs, whenever that was, one of the issues I ran in with this one in particular was the fact you needed a special key or something to access some of the SATA ports, because it was weird for whatever reason. Anyway, it's that one. That one has a Intel server motherboard, and its implementation of IPMI, or the Intelligent Platform Management Interface, has a web UI like my Dell servers do, but it has a couple of issues. The main one being it's kind of slow, and sometimes it just doesn't load for whatever reason. And I thought I fixed the issue a while back because originally I was sharing the Ethernet port that was being used for the IPMI with Proxmox. So I was wondering if the issue was there was just a lot of traffic going through that port, which was causing like some kind of bandwidth limitation or something. But obviously that wasn't the case, because for the past, I don't know how many months now, that port has been dedicated strictly for IPMI, and that's it. So I'm not exactly sure why it's still, being slow and whatnot. But anyway, before we get too off the rails, I've mentioned IPMI on a few episodes, but it's been a while since we kind of talked about what it is, so I figure might as well kind of give a recap to refresh people's memory, especially if you don't really deal with it. So IPMI, like I mentioned, is the Intelligent Platform Management Interface, and in a nutshell, it's specifications, I use that semi-loosely, to monitor information about a host and as well as control the system. And the reason why I say specifications kind of loosely is at the core there's a set of functionality that basically every implementation has, but how each OEM implements it is slightly different, or can be slightly different. One of the best examples I can give here is the IPMI raw commands. So IPMI has some pretty standard ones like your power and your chassis. So like, for instance, the power command, you can use that to either reboot the system, turn it on, turn it off. The chassis command, you can check the current status if it's powered on or not. You can get sensor information. So there's a lot of stuff that's fairly standard, but there are things like the IPMI raw commands, which allow you to do a lot more funky stuff. One that's really big in the home lab community is using the IPMI raw commands to manage your fan control, because enterprise servers are not exactly known for their silent runtime operation. Let's just say that. So one thing that people will tend to do, and I've also done, is they'll write scripts that essentially check the CPU temperature, and then based on the CPU temperature, they implement their own fan curve and will send IPMI raw commands to the system itself to control the fan speed that way. But the thing with these IPMI raw commands is they're essentially different between each OEM. So for instance, the span feed control is different from a Dell system to an HP system to an Intel system. So they're completely different. So the term specification is, in some cases, they're kind of more like guidelines, at least when you get into like the IPMI raw command space. But anyway, IPMI specifically essentially operates on a BMC, or a baseboard management controller, which in essence is a computer inside a computer, because this BMC, basically as soon as you plug in power to the server or the motherboard or whatever, the BMC essentially boots up and basically gives you that out-of-band access, or the ability to control the system even if it's not turned on. And this BMC also interfaces with the rest of your computer's components. So this is how you'll be able to view information like what CPU you have installed, what frequency it's running at, how much RAM you have installed, temperatures, fan speed, all that good stuff. So the out-of-band management also allows you to not only monitor the system health, but also allow you to remotely turn on and off the system. And assuming that you're running IPMI 2.0 and the OEMs implemented it, you can also get a KVM feature, or a keyboard, video, and mouse, which essentially gives you physical access even if you're remote. And put obviously physical in quotes there because you obviously don't have physical access to the system, but essentially what this allows you to do is, even if you are halfway around the world and you're at your corporate office or you're on vacation or something, and you VPN into the data center or into your home lab or what have you, you can connect in through the I almost said IPMI interface, which technically is redundant, but you could essentially connect in through that remote management interface there and connect to the KVM, and you would have a video display of what would be displayed if you plugged a monitor directly into the computer, and your mouse and keyboard would essentially act like you plugged a physical mouse and keyboard into the system, so you can directly manipulate it and control it that way. So super handy feature, especially for debugging purposes. It's definitely a really nice to have, because especially if you don't feel like listening to all the loud servers, or you can't actually get physical access to them, this essentially gives you the physical access you would need. So this can allow you to do things like installed operating systems, get into the BIOS, tons of different stuff. So super, super handy to have, and IPMI is fantastic. And a while back, we did like a talk about IPMI, and one thing that's kind of cool about I call it's kind of its younger brother, though it's not really. It's a completely different use case, but I call it Wake on LAN, which is completely different. But Wake on LAN, I dubbed kind of the poor man's IPMI, because Wake on LAN can at least allow you to remotely boot up a system, assuming it's enabled in the BIOS and whatnot. So it kind of similar to IPMI, but of course, as we kind of discussed through this brief recap, IPMI can do a heck of a lot more. And if you've never got to play around with it, one, you're kind of missing out, and two, it is kind of hard to go back, I will say. It is really nice to have. But anyway, getting back on topic here. So for whatever reason, in this particular instance of IPMI, going back to the fact that IPMI, the specifications is kind of more like guidelines, in this implementation specifically, if you look at the sensor information, for whatever reason, you cannot view the system's power draw. There's other things you can't view too, like it doesn't accurately, for whatever reason, report the CPU temperature, which is kind of weird. So like I said, specification used very loosely. But I wanted to know how much power this thing was drawing, and seeing that the web interface is kind of unreliable and also really slow, I wanted a way to quickly figure out how to pull that information. So I did some digging, and I found the IPMI raw command in order to specifically get the power draw info. And of course, this was nice, although the part of the issue was the data you get back is 100% in hex. So unless you can easily read hex on the fly and be able to parse a long hex string and easily pull out which bytes mean what, not the most helpful, right? So what I decided to do was create a Python script that would essentially infinitely loop, and I think I have it set to every second, to essentially run that IPMI raw command to query what the power draw is, and then essentially decode that data and format it nicely so I can get the printout of what the minimum usage is, what the current usage is, what the maximum usage is, and what the average usage is. Right at a glance, all in the terminal. Very, very nice. So it basically allowed me to more quickly and reliably monitor those power metrics, which I was quite happy about. So that was the home lab stuff I wanted to discuss. And now getting into some of the more software developmentally things, I basically turned into a graybeard in the sense that I was coding like the graybeards of yore. And the reason I say that is because this past weekend, I was without internet for at least 4+ hours. Like it was a solid amount of time that I did not have internet for. So I figured it would be a good opportunity to get some programming done. And this could have been a horrible idea because it's quite nice when you're programming if you run into a bug or an issue or you're not quite sure how to go about doing something, you can use the old interwebs to try to find a solution or to come up with ideas or what have you. So obviously that was not going to be an option because I didn't have internet. So that's why I said it potentially could not have actually been that good. But I did recently, if you listen to the past couple episodes, I did recently set up a large language model in my home lab, so worst comes to worst, I could have just spun that thing up and asked it some questions. But I didn't have to, since even though I didn't have internet, I honestly wasn't even tempted to use the internet because I was just on a roll. And I honestly kind of surprised myself because I was coding for a solid 2 to 2.5 hours before I finally got to what I thought was a pretty good stopping point. And honestly, through that entire time, totally forgot the fact that I was without internet. And I mean, I honestly, like I said, I was surprised. Like to me, and it just seemed like, normal day, everything was fine. And then the only kind of reason I realized I was without internet was when, after the coding session was over, I looked down at my phone and saw a bunch of notifications saying that my home lab was down because, of course, I didn't have internet. And then, of course, I guess the first question that I should have addressed was the internet being down actually my fault? Because as a home labber and someone that likes to tinker with various networking related things, it wouldn't have been, I'll just say this, it wouldn't have been the first time that I would have been without internet access due to completely because of my own doing, right? Whether I messed up a router configuration, forgot to, or did something with my DNS servers that took them offline, or for whatever reason made them unable to access the internet. There have been numerous reasons why I have not had internet access, and it's been 100% on me. But this time was not one of those times. And the funny thing was, after I had been without internet for, I want to say we were probably getting close to the 4-hour mark, my ISP sends me a text message and they're like, oh, there appears to be an outage in your area. And I was like, oh, really? I had no idea. But the reason why I also find it funny is because I think I got the text message around, I think it was after 5 o'clock in the evening. And they said in the message that they projected that internet would be restored around 10 o'clock that evening. And the funny thing was, pretty much as soon as they sent that message, my internet was working again. Now, I'm not complaining that I got it back, way before the projected time. But at the same time, it would have been nice to receive that message a few hours earlier, like when the internet was actually still down. But anyway, like I said, basically kind of felt like a graybeard because back in the day of the graybeards, they of course weren't able to ask ChatGPT, although I guess even without internet I still would have been able to ask ChatGPT. Well, not specifically ChatGPT since I don't have ChatGPT, but I do have a large language model, but that's kind of besides the point. The graybeards back in the day didn't have things like Stack Overflow or the internet in general that they could easily query. Their source of trying to figure things out was either looking at source code or asking other developers for questions or pointers or whatever. So yeah, kind of embraced my inner graybeard, I guess you could say. So I guess that kind of leads us into, if I was doing software development, what did I actually do? So I got the stats summary screen completely knocked out. So as a quick recap for anyone that's new, the video game I'm working on, I'm essentially trying to create my own Pokemon game from scratch. So I've been, over the past few weeks, been working on the summary screen, and I got the stats summary screen that displays all the various stats and EXP and all that stuff. That's all been completely implemented. I got the main window where it kind of shows the Pokedex number, name, nickname, level, that kind of thing. Got that sorted. And the other thing I also got knocked out was, I would say, 90% of the move interface. So if you've played a Pokemon game at all, you're familiar with the move interface. You kind of see the moves you have, and you can select each one of those moves, and it'll kind of give you some information about based on which one you select, it'll show you, what power the move has, accuracy, if it's a physical or special move, that kind of a thing. So got all that implemented. The only thing that I haven't implemented yet is the ability for you to swap moves in the moveset. That's kind of what I plan on doing next. And of course, there's no description, but the reason there's no description is because I haven't written them yet. I've been honestly kind of holding off on a lot of the mass data entry stuff like that until later, just because it's not all that applicable to making progress in the game. Because, of course it's necessary to have, but as far as implementing core features, displaying text on a screen that I can easily just pull from a function, it's once I write the descriptions, it's literally couple lines of code tops and it's implemented. So it hasn't been necessarily all that high on the priority list, but the main functionality of pulling the data I need and putting it where it's supposed to, that's basically done at this point. So yeah, those are the main updates. And I think with that, I kind of touched on AI and using ChatGPT and large language models. So I think that's probably a good discussion to have for the rest of the episode. And that is kind of centered around the idea of using artificial intelligence for software development. Is it a good idea? Should you do it? Should you not do it? What are the pros and cons? Now, I was kind of tempted, actually, to ask my large language model if it thinks that using AI is good for software development, but I didn't. I held off. I will say I would have thought it would have been kind of ironic to ask an AI what it thinks about using AI for things like software development, for instance, but I didn't. But this specifically, where I just kind of wanted to break down some of the reasons why it's beneficial and why it's also not beneficial. So for starters, it honestly depends on who you are, because I have personally used it for software development and in certain use cases, and I quite honestly have very mixed feelings about it, because first of all, it can either be useful, a complete waste of time, or it can just totally lead you in the wrong direction. Because as we've discussed on previous episodes with these large language models or LLMs, they're honestly pretty dumb, because they don't actually know anything. They don't know what they're saying. They're essentially just a fancy math function that predicts what the most it's essentially a predictive algorithm that predicts what's the highest probability of being correct coming next. But of course, it's not 100% certain, because if you've done any kind of looking into LLMs or read any kind of articles on them, you've probably heard the term of hallucinations, which is essentially when these large language models just completely make stuff up. And I've experienced it. The most recent experience that I had was the past couple episodes, or at least the last episode, when I was talking about trying to configure the Clang format. I had honestly never really used Clang format before, so I figured I'd ask the large language model, but just to try to help me, identify some things to configure. So essentially, I would give it like a code snippet and be like, based on this code snippet, what's the Clang format that I would use in order to get my code to look like this? And it spat out some results, and obviously through a lot of back and forth, was able to narrow down some potential flags to set and configure. But the reason why I bring this up is because one of the options that it gave me was not even a valid option in Clang format. It just totally made it up. So I've definitely experienced AI hallucinations. I'm sure most people that have used a large language model have as well. But the thing is, they're very, and this is kind of the problem with them, is they're very convincing, because when they spit out their output, they spit it out and then say it, I guess, and it's not really the right word, but you know what I mean. They say it in such like a confident tone that makes it believable. And unless you actually have any kind of knowledge on the topic you're asking it about, you could easily read what it said and be like, that sounds right, because it makes sense if you don't actually know what should be the right answer. But the thing is, if you actually know the topic you're asking it about, you can easily find all the various holes in its response, and can easily pick out, be like, that's wrong, that it totally just made up, and you can easily pick these things apart. So especially the place where you can really identify this is if you're trying to do something very niche or specific, or you're trying to use a very obscure framework, library, API, or something like that. The large language model will basically be absolutely no help to you. And that's just the truth, because the way that these language models become smart, in quotes, is based off their training data. So, of course, if you ask it to write a for loop, it's going to be able to do that no problem, because the copious amounts of code out there with for loops in them. But if you're trying to ask it for like a super niche framework, there's probably not as much data on it out there, so it's not going to have as much data to reference from to be order to generate legit output. So that is one kind of big issue with large language models, is depending on what you're trying to use it for, it could potentially be absolutely no help whatsoever. And if you specifically on the code portion, because we're trying to discuss if using AI is good for software development, in my experience with trying to ask it for actual code, I have come across 3 common scenarios that probably happen just as much, if not more often, than it actually doing what I want it to. And the majority of the time, I'd say that when I ask it for code, it either gives me something that doesn't work, doesn't even compile, or is just something completely different than what I asked. So sometimes it'll compile, but it doesn't work. Other times it might compile and work, but it's something completely different than what I was asking. And yeah, other times it just straight up doesn't work. So yeah, what I will say is one kind of issue that you'll find with large language models here is they can almost kind of be used as a crutch, because especially if you're asking it a bunch of very generalized things, like I said, if you're asking it to write a for loop to increment such and do X, Y, and Z math operation, it's probably going to be able to do that without issue. And if you kind of get used to it being able to generate your code for you, you'll probably kind of start to rely on it like a crutch. Like, it'll essentially become the Stack Overflow of the, I guess, the 2010s developers, if that's a right comparison. Like, of course, before the large language models, there was the whole thing of you go to Stack Overflow, find the solution to the issue you're having, you copy the code, paste it into your program, it runs, and you're good to go, right? That was kind of the old version. And, some people would have a crutch of, always going to Stack Overflow or some other internet source for the solutions to their problems rather than trying to figure it out themselves. And large language models can definitely become that new crutch for people, especially if you're not careful, and especially if you're just getting into software development. It's definitely something you want to try to avoid, because you want to be able to write the code yourself rather than just asking the large language model to do it. And as I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen if you used one yourself, is you can't trust these large language models as gospel and take whatever they say as truth, because a lot of times they either make stuff up or they're just wrong in general. So you definitely have to be careful about that. Now, at this point, now that I've sounded like an old grandpa that, thinking the old ways are better and the new ways are garbage, I do think there are some actually valid use cases for using LLMs in your software development. And like I kind of alluded to already, generalized coding principles like if statements, for loops, while loops, your core programming principles, the large language models, quite honestly, are, I would say, almost always going to get that right. Now, of course, you have to add the stipulation in there because they're not always going to get it right. But more often than not, if you ask them for something really basic, like, something with core programming fundamentals, they're going to be able to get it right. It's more so when you get into the nitty gritty, like asking them to implement a specific niche algorithm or some function where you potentially could run into issues. But if you're asking specifically for core fundamental stuff, probably not going to be an issue. So for generalized things, they generally tend to do pretty well. Another thing that they are pretty good at is they can give you a fairly good template or place to start if you truly are stuck. So as I mentioned, the code that they spit out might not work, might not even compile, and might not even do what you want it to do. But even in those cases, one thing that I found personally is it's at least given me a rough outline of how to structure the code, and based on trying to run it, seeing the compile errors that I get, identifying what's actually wrong and being able to go through and actually change things, fix things, and actually get them to work the way I want it to without necessarily having to write all, your standard template stuff and all your stuff you have to write when you're writing a program from scratch. So it can reduce some of that initial overhead of kind of setting everything up. So that is potentially nice. But again, you have to have that coding background of knowing how to solve problems, identify compile errors, figure out why something isn't doing what it's supposed to, being able to debug and that kind of stuff. You still have to have those core principles even when you use, one of these large language models. So another thing they can be semi-useful for, again, not guaranteed, but they can generally be fairly decent debugging tools, especially if you ask them For instance, if you have them generate code for you and you copy paste the code into your file and you try to compile and run it, if you get some kind of error, if you say, hey, I got this error with this line here, it's not working, this is what it did, but this is what I wanted to do, it can then go back and tweak the code, and sometimes it still won't get it right after many iterations, but that process of, interfacing with it can potentially help you identify what the actual issue is and help you fix it. So it's kind of like if we talked about rubber duck debugging I guess it was kind of a while ago, but we talked about rubber duck debugging and kind of this idea of walking through step by step and kind of writing out why your code isn't working. And as you kind of go through that process of analyzing line by line what it's doing, you'll potentially kind of have that light bulb moment go off where you kind of realize what your mistake was, and then you can go in and fix it. So that's kind of what you can if you go in with that mindset with a large language model in your debugging practice, it could potentially be a fairly useful debugging session. Now, personally, this next one I haven't used large language models for, largely because, first, I haven't tested it on the one that I host. And of course, I'm not uploading my code to a cloud large language model because they don't need to harvest my data and suck down all my juicy code to train their other models on. But one thing that you could use large language models for, which could also honestly be quite beneficial, is copying code that either you're not quite sure how it works, or maybe it's code that you wrote and you don't feel like writing the documentation for. So you just copy it into the large language model and say either one, what does this code do? And generally it would probably give you a decent explanation, or at least give you kind of the gist of what's going on. Or if you told it to document your code, it could, write that documentation for you, and then you could kind of tweak as necessary. So kind of doing, I guess, a little automation, if you will, of it. And one kind of big use case that I've also used, which could also be beneficial to you, is translation of code. So for instance, if you were writing a program in Rust and you were trying to search how to, perform some kind of algorithm, for instance, and the example of the algorithm you found was in Java, if you didn't feel like hand translating that Java code into Rust code, you could just, copy the Java code, paste it into the large language model and say, hey, take this Java code here and translate it into Rust for me. And while the output that you get might not necessarily be 100%, again, it would at least, kind of going back to what we said earlier, kind of giving you that template, at least putting you in the ballpark of where you need to be, so then you can kind of make the final tweaks as needed in order to fully implement the code, rather than you having to analyze, the code and translate line by line. It can potentially save you some time. So there are some definite benefits to using large language models, but again, you definitely have to be careful with it because, in the case for this translation case, will it be correct? Not necessarily, but again, at least just giving you that template, putting you in the ballpark, so you don't have to manually do that translation, because I have done my fair share of translating programs from one language to another. And while it's definitely a solid learning experience, don't get me wrong, sometimes I just want this to be implemented in another language. So, just be able to easily do that translation, get yourself in the ballpark, make the necessary tweaks you need to for where the large language model inevitably messed up, and then you saved yourself a bunch of time. So there is potential for a lot of time saving. There's potential to essentially kind of use it as a peer programmer, someone to kind of bounce ideas off of. There are definitely benefits, but again, you also have to be careful when using these tools, because they don't know what they're doing. They're just a predictive algorithm that thinks they're selecting the optimal next word, even if that's complete garbage. The other thing is sometimes, especially like I mentioned, if you're trying to do something very niche, they don't necessarily have as much data on that, so they won't be as helpful. And if you use them too much, you can kind of get into this mindset of using them as a crutch. And in general, you want to have that good foundation of software development and just kind of use these models, if you use them at all, to build on the skills you already have and to automate and make your life easier rather than using them as your crutch. Because one thing I will say, depending on if you have aspirations of getting into software development as a career, I can tell you this already, that corporations definitely don't want you copying and pasting their proprietary code into tools like ChatGPT to help you write code and debug your solution. They definitely won't want you doing that. Now, I have heard some companies have already spun up their own internal large language models for developers to use, but again, it's definitely not something you want to rely on as a crutch, because once you actually get into the real world of writing code, you won't necessarily be able to rely on it as much as you could, say, if you're working on a personal project. So that is kind of the nutshell of should you use AI for software development. Again, it kind of really comes down to, if you're a new developer, I would avoid it because it could potentially make bad habits and make you reliant on it. But if you have a strong foundation in software development and you're just using it to automate things like translating code from one language to another, using it to bounce ideas off of, using it as a debugging partner, things like that, where it's potentially could be add to something that you're already really good at and can fix the garbage that it might give you. Or if you're just trying to look for a template as a starting point, it can definitely provide some serious benefit, but you also have to be wary that not everything it gives you is actually good and legitimate. Because one thing I also saw, I think there was a YouTube video. I want to say it was from Low Level Learning, but I'm not 100% sure. Basically asking ChatGPT to write code for it, and then essentially picking it apart and finding a bunch of different, security vulnerabilities in it. So again, not 100% gospel, not the best code in the world, but it can, at least if you need something quick to, like a template as a starting point and you already know what you're doing, it could potentially be a decent option. But again, I would not rely on it as a crutch. And quite honestly, personally, like for example, the Pokemon game I'm working on, aside from trying to bounce ideas on how to get Clang to work, I have not yet used any kind of large language model for any of the development on there. And quite honestly, I don't plan to. The only time I've really used it for coding is when there was a couple of times where I saw a cool demo that someone did in some other language, and I kind of wanted it in a language I was more comfortable with. So rather than having to translate everything into the language I wanted, threw it into ChatGPT, got a translation. Of course, the translation didn't work. So then, of course, I had to go through and rewrite a decent amount of the code to get it actually functioning the way I wanted it to. But at least it gave me that good, solid foundation and starting point, so I didn't have to start from scratch. So yeah, that's what it is in a nutshell. It can be beneficial, but you also have to be very careful when using it, and definitely not something you want to rely on as a crutch. And before we go for the day, let's get back to our trivia question for this week. So if you recall, a modem is a device that converts data from a digital format to an analog format. But what does modem stand for? If you said modulator demodulator, you are correct, and you got this trivia question correct for this week. So congratulations if you did, and if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to give it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and be sure to share it around, especially if you know any software developers, and if definitely want to make sure they're aware about the usage of large language models, and also if you know any TikTok addicts that haven't been made aware yet of the bill that just got passed in the U.S. House. Maybe it would definitely be a wake-up call for them, but in fairness, I did kind of give them some ways around in order to keep fulfilling their addiction, even if the ban does actually go through and the 6 months pass and TikTok eventually does get banned. But of course, that would not even a sure thing yet and would definitely be way down the road. But if you have any questions about this episode or topics or ideas for future episodes, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or of course there's a link down in the show notes that you can click on as well. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.